Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome to this very special edition, live edition of Voternomics, where politics and markets collide. This year, as we all know, voters around the world have the capacity to turn markets, countries, and economies like never before. I'm Stephanie Flanders, Head of Economics and Government here at Bloomberg.
I'm Allegra Stratton. I write the readout, and I used to be in government. Before that, I was on TV.
I'm Adrian Wooldridge. I'm Global Opinion columnist for Bloomberg Opinion.
I'm a guest. I'm
Special guest.
and I'm the editor at Bloomberg.
So we have brought in our special guest, also our boss, for this event. And I guess by accident or by design, we've ended up doing it at the end of maybe another week coming up, but at the end of a pretty incredible week in Voternomics land. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's inexplicable decision to skip a big chunk of the D-Day commemorations last week, despite the best efforts of his spin doctors, still taking up a lot of discussion, although I guess it has distracted us from what was previously his most inexplicable decision, which was to call the election in the first place. But then we have, just in the last 24 hours, French President Emmanuel Macron, not to be outdone, has decided that he too wants to call a snap election that he doesn't need to call when he's heavily behind in the polls. That in response to some pretty interesting European election results. The markets have responded pretty sharply this morning, particularly in the French markets. But I think we've got plenty more to discuss around those elections, which, in some ways followed what people had thought, but I think is not as clear a picture as, not a completely clear picture. And of course, we have that stunning gamble by President Macron. We obviously have to talk about the US because it's impossible not to, although that's still many months away. And we luckily have Peggy Collins, Washington Bureau Chief, here to talk a bit about that. And we have the Queen of Bloomberg Television, Francine Lacqua, to help talk through the European results. But I guess we have to start with this all-star cast that we already have. We should start with the UK. And Allegra, you sort of hinted to it, but you were a former advisor to Rishi Sunak and also number 10.
I can feel it.
You were a strategist and
high-minded
mind, and you also still have, your family still have, shall we say, close connections to Rishi's decisions. So I mean, just the outside eye, it just doesn't seem like it's going that well.
So what you're going to notice is that Stephanie teases me on Voternomics, doesn't she? Teases/reserves quite tough questions. I think he has had. There was in the last week a very.
To be clear, he is Rishi Sunak.
Sorry, Rishi Sunak, the current Prime Minister, has had a good outing and had a really bad outing. D-Day was an incredibly damaging episode for him, but I think the TV debate was a pretty good outing for him, and it just goes to show, frontline politics is a roller coaster and is incredibly tough. And I think the two things they are interesting and they are linked, which is there they are resetting what they wanted to do, which is reset the agenda to talk about tax. And they did it fairly effectively. Yes, there was a great big Barney about the veracity of the claim, which they're leaning into and they're enjoying and wanting.
The claim of a £2,000 tax rise under
which they've pumped out
over 4 years.
Over 4 years, which they've pumped out more material on over the last few days. But then the decision to come back from D-Day early was really regretful. You've seen and heard Rishi Sunak apologise profusely, indeed again today. I think the only thing that is perhaps lost, I think, sometimes in the sort of row about it is, having been in government, it is quite incredible to get that sort of the busyness of, you've got an itinerary. I'm not saying, by the way, this means that it was okay for him to, he's a leader and he should have really stress tested the decision. But you get an itinerary, you're told to go to the airport at a certain time, there is a car, you get pushed into it. And I think, if and when Keir Starmer becomes the next Prime Minister, he will have some moments like these, right? There's a lot about government that is, too busy, too fast for any human being to process adequately. But that doesn't mean that Rishi shouldn't have said, hold on a second, there's a big event going on and I can see Biden flying in and shouldn't I be there?
I've been trying to explain to myself how he came to make this rather catastrophic decision. And I had two explanations. One is that he's a Wickhamist, and Wickhamists don't understand this sort of thing.
Our
And you have
international
to leave the
listeners, that means
government
he
of the
went to
country to its
Winchester
onions.
School.
The second explanation is that he's too assiduous a student of Walter Bagehot. Walter Bagehot was the great 19th century constitutionalist and editor of The Economist, who argued that there are two branches of British government, the dignified branch and the efficient branch. And the dignified branch is the branch that the monarchy occupies, and the efficient branch is the branch that sort of technocrats do, and they take their real serious decisions. And I think he's also always been a person who thinks that government is about delivering things efficiently, doing spreadsheet-style things. He's never liked the ceremonial side of government.
So up to a point, and that a large part of how you describe Rishi is fair. But he also does have this quite powerful sense of national service, and of
and national service,
but service of a different sort as well. And also, I mean, he himself has done a lot for veterans, and you know, the idea, just flip it, right? This is always the helpful way to look at these things. If you say, you know, do you want to sort of snub 80-year-old, 100-year-old D-Day? You know, there's no way he would have done.
Give you some credit, Allegra. I mean, Thursday afternoon, there was that odd thing where, and we should move on from this quite soon because I know people have heard a lot about this. But you know, there was interestingly that the press corps, by and large, had it had gone without notice to some degree, or people had not really considered it to be a big problem potentially until they saw the photos. But I did notice, I mean, the readout, the daily newsletter, we actually had pointed it out, and I think we're the first to really sort of make an argument of it and say this seems a bit odd. Not saying that we, quite predicted how large it would be, but I mean that you sort of can't get. I quite slightly get the sense that if you'd been sitting in the room, you would have said, "Isn't this a bit weird?" Wouldn't you have said, Allegra?
Yeah, because for all the reasons everyone here, will be familiar with, but it is look, he's building a campaign based on attracting a certain demographic, older demographic, though, by the way, younger people would be as, upset by the decision to come back from D-Day. But, strategically, it didn't make any sense. But also, it's just who he is. He's a respectful guy, right?
Adrian,
you know him.
When you just to sort of go off something that Allegra said, she said, obviously, the goal of the week, and to some extent even of calling the election, was to reset the ground and to change the terms of the debate.
Yes.
I mean, clearly there is someone who's done that in the last week outside of the D-Day discussion, and that is Nigel Farage.
Yes, and I think what's happened in this campaign is a very, very dark and unpleasant man has put himself right at the centre of it. And he's completely changed the tenor of the campaign. He is attracting votes from the right of the Conservative Party. He may well win a seat, and as a result of winning that seat, he may be central to the reconstruction, the recombination of the right after the election. But he is a very, very bad man who's wants to take Britain in very, very dark directions, I think.
We talked a bit about this last week on the podcast, but do you think that we will quite soon see the Reform overtake the Conservatives in the polls?
I think
will that be a signal moment for many in the?
I think if Reform overtakes the Conservatives in a sustained way, that is a very important moment in British politics. Already they have overtaken the Conservatives in a lot of red wall seats, and that's beginning to have impact. We have Suella Braverman saying that, there isn't really a cigarette paper between her and Nigel Farage, and we have the Reform Party taking potentially a lot of money. The Tory party, one of the many odd things about this election is the Tory party hasn't got very much money. I think it's pulled its spending on social, as it's called, because they haven't got enough money to spend on it. And we could see Farage and the Reform Party outspending the Tories. So I can see a situation in which they really accelerate.
John, because you're so important and you get to sort of flit around the world, but particularly you're spending quite a lot of time in the US. I know you've been there and a range of other places in the last week or so. How much is any of this discussion changing the way people look at the election, or how indeed is the election coming across to people?
I think if you look at it from outside, and you're right. I've been in Europe and US for the past 10 days, but particularly from that angle, I think people take several things away. Number one is immigration, and that's because exactly the same problems that they're seeing. This is a kind of immigration election they detect, and they think the same kind of things are coming in America, and you're already seeing the European elections. I think the second thing is just the straightforward political horse race. It's very odd, especially in America, to think of someone who calls an election when they're 20 points behind. What's behind that? That has broken through into the American audience far more than the D-Day thing, which, to be honest, they really didn't see. They just saw pictures of Biden looking a bit doddery. And the last thing, which actually is, I think, interesting, and I think I've heard this more in America than Europe, paradoxically, is Brexit. Every American business person you talk to says, look, the big thing which has affected the way we look at Britain is Brexit. Why aren't you talking about that? Why isn't that the big subject of the campaign? And if you ask them, you point out the Tories are in trouble, they assume that is because of Brexit. And a lot of these are people who have very little to no admiration for the European Union. They're not in that way. They're just looking at it in a pragmatic way, saying this country took this momentous decision, which by virtually every method, I'm not trying to refight that battle, but by every conceivable thing they can see, it has not worked. Why isn't that the main thing? So there's a weird way whereby the people outside, in some ways, are looking on us, sort of saying we're avoiding the elephant in the room in a way that we might be.
Adrian, Allegra, we're going to carry on ignoring it, aren't we? Briefly.
Well, strangely, the Lib Dems, who you would have thought would be the one party that would be shouting about this, have now said they're not going to, campaign on taking Britain back into the EU, and the Labour Party has got an obvious reason not to talk about it. I was at an event with a senior Labour person who was talking on and on and on. He said Brexit has been an absolute disaster. It's caused all this trouble. The Tories are idiots. How can they have done something so stupid? So I said, so you're going to take us back into the EU, are you? And he suddenly reversed and said, oh, no, we can't relitigate that. So it caught in a very peculiar bind that they think it was a disaster, but don't want to reverse it.
There's no appetite.
No. I was just going to pick something up that our boss said,
well done.
which is, I'm not sure it is an immigration election. I mean, Nigel Farage would like it to be an immigration election, but actually, well, what is it as an election? It's a good question because it's sort of each week has a different theme, and actually there isn't one clear kind of this is just the unanswerable big boulder that everybody has to pick up. It's 1 week was tax, and it really was big tax last week, right?
It would be fair to say, the £2,000 did seem to break through a bit because I think people outside, especially business people, had taken on board the idea that Starmer was not going to be a big change, that there might be some changes at the margin, but suddenly the idea of people paying £2,000 more, that was one thing which did get through, perhaps, I would argue, perhaps even more than the D-Day thing.
It's an election without a theme, but it's also an election without a promise. I mean, in 1997, everybody was incredibly optimistic about new Labour doing lots of new and exciting things. I mean, we're just saying about Starmer, well, he's not going to be quite as bad as this awful lot that we've got, so let's vote for him.
But is the theme going to be that we're seeing the disintegration of the Conservative Party and all of what we thought would play out on the other side of a Labour victory actually playing out rather sooner? Is that what we had a hint of from the last one? So
you think so? I don't think so. You go first.
Well, no, I think the Tory party is clearly falling apart. I think when you have a situation in 1983, the Labour Party called an emergency press conference and said, the rumours you're hearing are not true. Michael Foot is still our candidate. And there's almost a sense...
Has our full confidence.
Yes, he has our full confidence. And there's almost a sense that is happening, that, things have got so bad that there was a period in which people thought that Rishi might actually pull out of this thing, and that the Tory party had to reassure the country that he won't. So that's a pretty bad situation to be in. It's the party that's falling apart.
And as one result of that, we were just talking about this earlier, that on the night, the results actually suddenly become much more interesting. I mean, of course, there'll be the sort of, one assumes the size of the Labour victory, but actually what is left in Parliament is now suddenly rather up for grabs. so many things get mashed by the fact that reform is
you could get a
taking
reverse
some of those
1983 in which a party does well in the polls but doesn't get any seats. The Tories could hold up but still be
which is what happened
crushed.
in 2015 as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But look, you're right. And what we've seen today is Suella Braverman out of the traps, quickly wanting to, stand shoulder to shoulder with Farage and so on. And that the optics of that, I get, make it look like it's sort of already a done deal, that there'll be some stitch up and so on. But the reality of it, to your point, Steph, which is totally right, is that it's all about the numbers, what the numbers are. And by the way, I've covered enough elections, so have we all, to know that, and I know this sounds, sort of spin doctory-ish, but that, we don't, so much can happen in 3 weeks. So much can happen in 3 weeks. You had Nick Clegg riding high in that TV debate, and then the numbers were not at all what he thought would be. Anyway, we don't know, so it's slightly foolish to even sort of go there. But if the opinion polls now are what are right, then of course it is an existential crisis for the Conservative Party. The question then becomes what actually, which is the dominant faction, whether there's a number of factions or whether it's actually,
Which is also completely unclear and is hard to
Nobody
say
knows.
today.
Nobody knows. So Suella Braverman might be, quickly trying to kind of, be Nigel Farage's best mate. But actually, there'll be One Nation Tories who will not be okay with that happening to the Conservative Party. But also within that sort of world that Suella occupies, there are people with a different view, which is, if I'm going to take over this Conservative Party, I'm not going to give it to him. I'm going to take it over. So you've got, it's just, yes, Suella and the pictures and everything she said today suggests that, they're getting very much ahead of themselves. But I think it is just that. I think they're getting ahead of themselves. We don't know the exact complexion of the result.
It's quite an interesting counterpoint is you can have the British election with, at the moment, I think we all agree, a likely Tory defeat. Almost straight afterwards, you're going to have the Trump convention. And if you look at conservatism generally, when you said is conservatism in trouble, you have two different versions. You might find it being trounced at the ballot box here in one way. But in America, you might find a man appearing who, in many ways, certainly when Adrian and I used to write about it, that version, whatever Trump stands for, many people would not have seen that as remotely compatible with, say, Ronald Reagan on virtually every single issue.
Well, as befits our grand leader, you have given me a magisterial way of moving us on.
I'm a segue dressed up as an editor.
No, but a wise and meaningful segue. We can take a breath and think about the US, because I think it is now we should think about the US. After that seamless transition, yes, we are delighted. I should probably, those of you who are listening, to paint the scene briefly, we are in the Bloomberg sort of premium event space on the 7th floor of our equally premium headquarters in the City of London, nestled between the Bank of England and Cannon Street Tube. St Paul's, nice vista of the St Paul's. But Margaret Collins, we have visiting from Washington. She's our Washington bureau chief and indeed runs all the economics and government coverage in the US. Peggy, it's funny because I think, and we've already heard a bit of this, when Europeans and Brits certainly looking at the US election kind of mesmerised by it, and they see all the worries around President Biden's age, they see any number of worries and sort of perplexedness about Donald Trump, the convictions, the trials, everything else. But actually, if you're in America, it feels a bit more similar to some of the forces that we're seeing driving the European and the UK elections. A lot of the debate is around immigration. A lot of it is about inflation and the economy.
That's right. As John was just saying, immigration has become a theme here in your election, but it really has become a big theme in the U.S. Really at the start of this year, we started to see in our reporting when we were in Iowa for the primaries and New Hampshire for the primaries, when we were talking to people, Iowa's in the middle of the country, New Hampshire's at the northern border. Immigration and border security were coming up time and time again when we were asking voters what they were thinking about. And in March, I actually traveled to the Texas border because I wanted to make sure that I understood the perspectives of people there to inform our coverage going into the election this year. So as Stephanie's saying, immigration has become a huge theme in this election, in part because the Texas governor did start busing some of the migrants that were coming across the southern border to bluer states like Chicago and New York. And it did change some of the dynamic of who was caring about it and why. I think the Biden administration is in a tough spot when it comes to immigration and border security, in large part because the president is quite dependent on Congress for funding and legislation to get some of the bigger changes done. And so he is in a tough spot there. The other thing is that former President Trump has really tied immigration and border security to national security. So that's in large part why you see a lot of the Republicans saying they won't support funding for Ukraine, for example, unless there's equivalent funding put into border security. So I think on both sides, there's a lot of rhetoric. And then as Stephanie mentioned, the other big theme that comes up when we talk to voters and when we do our swing state poll in 7 of the most competitive states in the U.S., which we've been doing since October of last year, is the economy. And when I say the economy, what I mean is the cost of living. And this year, that's really been centered around housing and energy costs, utility costs, as well as gas costs, or I guess you would say petro costs here, and really the cost of living and also inflation. Really, people are very focused on is their spending power the same as it was maybe 4 years ago?
Peggy, has it gone into a new phase, the election, at the moment?
It's interesting, Allegra. Only in the past few weeks have I really felt like we've had a next chapter start, and it's for 2 main reasons. The Trump trial in New York changed the way that Trump could campaign. He was in the courtroom in New York and required to be for 3 out of the 5 days of a week. So that's meant that he had to do a lot of his campaign rallies of sorts in places like the Bronx in New York, where the Yankees play. I'm a Yankees fan, had to get that in there. But once the trial was completed and he was found guilty on all 34 accounts, as we all probably know, he has been able to campaign again in some of the battleground states. So just this weekend, he went to Las Vegas and started talking to people there about floating some ideas around not taxing tips, for example, for waitresses and service workers there. And that was an indication that he is really focused on getting, more workers and service workers in places like Las Vegas that were hit hardest in the pandemic to pay attention to his message. So that's something. And the other thing that changed in this next chapter is the fact that after the conviction result, Trump gathered a lot of money right out of the gate with his fundraising, over $50 million right in the first few days after that. And up until this point, Biden has had a huge advantage when it comes to cash and donations. We'll get some more information next week in terms of data on how close this gap is now, but it is closing as a result.
Peggy, it comes and goes, the focus on Biden's age and his strength level, should we say. And there was a Wall Street Journal piece that had got a lot of attention in the last week that was sort of claiming to be based on certain reporting. I think it's been somewhat discredited by other reporting, like where those quotes were coming from. But he's doing a lot of travel last week and this week. Do you expect that to be, again, a focus?
I do. It's very much so scrutinized everywhere he goes, really, in terms of his endurance levels. We did see an uptick in people's perceptions of his age right after the State of the Union. He seemed to get some positive remarks on that. I have seen Trump at rallies as well, and he does have a lot of endurance and energy there. So one of the things that's coming up at the end of this month, which will be a telltale, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, John, would be the debate that's coming up. The first debate between Biden and Trump will be at the end of June. And that will be something I think people will be looking at in terms of age.
Peggy, can I ask you a sort of rudimentary question? America's a big country with a lot of people in it, and it's got quite a lot of talent. How did you end up with these 2 candidates? It's very odd.
Well, it's something that we often think about a lot, both as reporters and Americans. And our colleague, Josh Green, who's a fabulous Business Week writer, did a story with our reporter, Nancy Cook, last year that coined the phrase the double haters, which is a lot of people were not happy with either candidate. And so you do get the sense that a lot of Americans were hoping that it would not necessarily come down to these two candidates, but I think a lot of it has to do with our system now is infused with a lot of money. We was just talking about the money and fundraising gap, and that has changed a lot of the way that candidates are able to succeed. And the other is media. I mean, Trump gets a lot of free media, and that is something that someone like a Nikki Haley had to really overcome and wasn't able to.
These TV debates are so intense. Do you know anything about how his team is prepping him?
It's something that's a reporting target for us right now.
I want to know.
Exactly.
Now.
I know, Allegra. But I think, they go through every scenario that you could possibly do. And the one thing I will say is that both men, at this point, know each other's strategies and teams very well. So that is something that will, be in their favor in some ways.
The one thing you hear from the Democrats a lot is that they want the same Biden who appeared at the State of the Union. Yeah. And that if he comes out like that, it's great. But if he doesn't, maybe change him.
And then, as you said, John, we go right after the debate to the conventions in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where Trump will be. And then at the very end of August, we'll be in Chicago with Biden. So it'll be a summer of both of them having to endure and have the stamina to go through.
There's obviously, you're having to sort of game out even now, thinking about election night and the potential for possibly a drawn-out conflict, tussle over the result, and we saw in our swing state poll rising concern from people on both sides of potential violence around the election. One of the things that I was struck by talking to some people who spent a lot of time in the swing states doing polling, and was a contrast to many recent elections, was this idea that low turnout would actually, on balance, be good for Biden. And of course, we're just not used to thinking that. We tend to think the Democrat vote is going to be higher the more people you get out. But because of the way Trump has scrambled, attracted a lot more young voters and the sort of additional number of younger African-American voters, and just the way things are playing out, what people care about, the kind of people who vote for Trump are maybe not so likely to vote. That seems to be one thing that maybe people listening might have underestimated or not realized. Are there other things that people should look out for that we might not be thinking about now?
Well, a couple things come to mind. I think the Biden campaign feels that there could be a path to winning that is unusual this year because of changes in population and the way we do the census in the U.S. And that would be, if he lost all the southern states, that he still may be able to win by achieving victories in what we call the blue wall, which is Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and also one random electoral vote in Omaha, Nebraska, which is a very Republican state. And some of you may know it because of Warren Buffett. He actually lives there. But Nebraska is not a winner.
He raises the average wealth level.
He does. Nebraska is traditionally a very Republican state, but Omaha has become more liberal over time. So it would be possible for Biden to lose all of the competitive swing states if they end up being the ones that we tend to think of, and yet wins the so-called blue wall plus one electoral vote in Omaha. I think the other thing that people may not realize, and what we've been trying to do a lot of reporting around at Bloomberg, is the number of people who moved in the U.S. After COVID. The 2020 election was in November 2020, but a lot of people didn't decide in the U.S. where they were going to live because of things like working from home or return to office, which we're in favor of here at Bloomberg. That was for you, John.
I didn't realize that.
But there, in some of our reporting, we've shown that in some swing states, about some 19% of eligible voters have turned over in some of these swing states. So who those people are...
19, yeah.
Yeah, and who those people are, the demographics of them and how they may vote, to Stephanie's point, could be really interesting and a big surprise. And lastly, I'll just say there are some ballot initiatives in some states like Florida and then Arizona and Nevada that could turn out voters for Democrats and help them more than we expect.
Peggy Collins, thank you so much for helping us out.
Thank you for having me, Stephanie.
Okay, so to continue the series of star turns from our Bloomberg stars, we have Francine Lacqua, who is well known to lots of people as our main anchor, beloved by many very senior interviewees like Christine Lagarde and others. You're from, I don't know, several European countries.
Depending on who wins at football, I change.
So you're the perfect person to help us think about these European election results. But I guess we have to talk initially about this enormous gamble by President Macron.
I don't know what happened. So John interviews President Macron like 4 weeks ago, and then he has like a PM. He has a PM drop out of D-Day, kind of last minute. Then he has a state dinner with Biden, and I'm told by people inside the room that certainly his prime minister was extremely worried about the elections. And then, I'm told that he's a very careful, individual who actually procrastinates decisions. And we know that his team around him, his cabinet, didn't know that he would, dissolve the assembly and kind of call for legislative elections. So it was a little bit of a surprise. The markets, as you say, tanked this morning for various reasons, which we can go into. And I think the question is, did he see it as a political opportunity? Because it would probably be difficulty in the autumn when they had to do the budget, that he would have to dissolve the assembly anyway. Or does he really see this as an opportunity? I know we were having a chat with Adrian and saying it's never great to call out the citizens who vote, but there is, I think, a belief in the Macron camp that he can win this. Turnout was very low for the Europeans. Brussels is kind of far away. And so I think he believes, and his camp believes, that they voted for Marine Le Pen's party saying, it doesn't really affect me, that back home it would be different. So turnout of French voting for the Europeans was about 50%. Nationally, usually it's 70%. But it's a gamble because he's basically staking his legacy. People say that he also maybe wants to rerun in 2032, which is unclear constitutionally when he can.
So the next presidential election is 27.
Yeah, and then it's 5 years.
He can't run in.
He can't run.
Yeah.
Unclear whether he can run in the next one, whether it's 3 terms that have to be consecutive. But it's clear, John, that he kind of wants to, that the center wants to get rid of.
I think he's more of a guy. I disagree with Francine a bit. I think he's more of a gambler, Macron, because many of us used to know him quite well because he was the person you went to go and see before you went to go and see Hollande when he was president. The thing about Macron is that he owes everything to one enormous gamble, which was to run for president with no party behind him, nothing. And I think every now and again he thinks it's worth, and obviously here he thinks it's worth flicking the dice. I think his gamble is pretty much what Francine said. I think that the other thing is, in this case, the alternative is pretty bad because he had definitely lost the momentum in France. I think he thinks that the next few years would be something where he would be unable to achieve much at all. And this gives him away, one of, if the National Front gets in, then he puts them on the spot. They will suddenly stop being a party of protest. They will have to come up with things, which Adrian's about to say is a very foolish strategy. But the other one is, I think he thinks that really confronted by that reality, people will back him.
Well, the last time I can remember a politician making a big gamble which involved calling out the people was in 2016 when David Cameron
I don't know what you're talking about.
It didn't necessarily go very well. I think he can only have done this, unless he's foolish and a gambler, because he considered that a Le Pen win was almost a done deal, that she was just the movement was too powerful, that he was too doomed.
Le Pen win
as president.
In the presidential race. So it was an act of desperation. He looked at the tea leaves and said, everything's moving in their direction. I need to try and shake things up. I need a surprise.
He is an optimist, though, and I do hear from people close to him that he thinks he has a shot. And what's interesting is that there's a lot of smart kind of geopolitical analysts looking at what a Le Pen presidency means. There's very few that are looking like what a Bardella, which is her main candidate, prime minister means. And that could be, it's tricky.
The trouble with, the presidential system, the president tends to get the blame when things go wrong. So it won't be the prime minister who gets the blame. It will be the president. The president is a blame magnet. And if he's presiding over a divided, dysfunctional political system, I don't think that's a good way of salvaging your reputation.
When you talk to them, I mean, this is before all this, but, a few months ago, when you would sort of put to them, look, you're not going to be able to, doesn't this mean you're not going to be able to do any of your unpopular reforms, this side of the presidential election? And their view has always been that action was better than inaction, and that the more that you can tar the opposition with, disagreeing with you on responses to the things that voters actually care about, the more, that was their best chance, is to actually be trying to do stuff that is seen, at least is trying to tackle the problems that voters are seeing, rather than rejecting. And you could paint the Rassemblement National as the sort of rejecting force. I mean, I guess that's part of it. It's the idea that you put them on the spot and say, do you actually want to make the world a better place, or are you just running for the presidential?
But France has a big, many civil servants that if they get into power will kind of make it work. So there's a, analysis that actually they could mess up, that Le Pen could mess up, or her party, if they come into power. I mean, you still have an apparatus. I think the campaigning will be very important. On the economy, Le Pen does not have a great track record on what she wants to do. We have not really seen a manifesto. We've been calling chief executives from the CAC 40 saying, who do you think is finance minister if Bordel becomes prime minister? And we don't really have an answer because their economic team haven't been around. And actually, a lot of the chief executives have not really engaged from what I gather.
You have a finance minister that you don't know, Francine. Shocking.
I do think there's a thing about Macron. As you look at Macron's history, this is from somebody who's one of his closest, I suppose, advisors and also possibly rivals. The basic thing, you look at Macron came in as this candidate of change, and he went quite hard by French standards down that path. And then suddenly, as the last presidential election arrived, he switched the other way around and went to stasis and stopped. And now, if you look at all the things he's done recently, from the interview with The Economist, he's done various other things, calling, and with us as well, calling for really dramatic changes again. And suddenly Macron now is this new figure who's trying to, as he sees it, reimagine Europe. So he's absolutely, in a much bigger way than anybody, you could argue, since Delors, has started to put forward new visions for Europe. And yet his problem is nobody's listening. The French have turned against him. He doesn't get on well with the Germans. And so he's trying to do anything he can to change that. So I think it's not just a simple matter of electoral things. He has a sense of mission about this.
You've taken us on to the sort of broader European picture, and the results, had been sort of those European election results had been predicted to be good for the right. It's certainly good for the right in France. And you've had
extreme
Macron
right,
responded extreme right, and the establishment centre right, centre left parties in Germany also completely humbled. But Francine, quite a kind of complicated picture around that. It's not obviously going to see a big shift in the way the European Parliament works.
No, and we don't really know what happens to the Commission president. I mean, I love it's like horse wrangling, right? So I give you this, I give you that. So in terms of numbers, she has enough numbers, we think, to stay on for another term
Ursula von der
Leyen as president of the Commission. But of course, they'll probably need to get more votes from center left in the European Parliament. She needs a majority of votes from heads of state. And again, if you're a head of state and you think, look, I have the rise of the right, do I want to be giving away kind of, policies are more left-leaning so that Ursula von der Leyen can stay? So I think there's going to be a lot of horse trading. We thought usually it takes a month, maybe 5 weeks to have a president that either stays on or you have a new one. Because of the French elections, this could be delayed. I mean, he's a little bit busy. At some point, there was a rumor about Mario Draghi, which, I don't know how much political capital Macron has now, but
where do you think Meloni, your country?
Your country.
Where would she go?
So Meloni is probably the biggest winner in these elections. Right? She solidified also her power in the European Parliament. I hear a lot of business people, but also politicians saying she's normalized the far right because she stayed the course on Europe, because she stayed the course on reforms, because she still supports money being sent to Ukraine, despite in the past friendships with Putin. And so it's actually also Meloni being the poster child. And we saw Le Pen trying to get closer to Meloni in the last 3 weeks. She's kind of the poster child of, look, she's, right, maybe far right, and she's made it work for the economy. And so she's, she had a big smile when she was talking to the press today.
Fran, the climate programme is in some trouble, it looks like, because even though, as you say, the macro groupings are enough to sort of keep the headline targets okay, in reality, the implementation is going to be tough when you have so many more voices saying we've just heard from the electorate and they don't want as much of this as we thought they did.
Yeah, and it goes back to, again, I mean, I think France was a good point because, there's like a fourth power, which is people in the streets. And we saw it with the Gilets jaunes, this idea that if you become more green, then it's the person on the street that gets taxed more. And so there's almost, I wouldn't say abandonment of green policy, but you could really see a shift on green policy appetite from the Commission and the European Union.
I should butt in just to remind everyone, QR code for putting in your questions. We've got a few people who put in questions. We're going to move to that in a second, but I know Adrian is about to say something very wise.
I'm trying to think if there are any general patterns in what we've seen. You might say we've seen the rise of populism in all of these elections we're seeing, but in fact, a pretty populist leader in India was slightly humbled in all this. Are we seeing a shift to the right? Well, yes, but not in Britain. And I think if I can think of anything that seems to be going on, it's anti-incumbency. All over the place, incumbents are being humbled, being brought down. The people, in general, are voting against incumbents because they're pretty annoyed. They're pretty angry.
I mean, so not in Italy and Greece. Actually, the prime minister there did pretty well. So I think it's really case by case.
Right.
But I think John's point to the fact that you don't have this Franco-German alliance anymore really goes to the heart of Europe. And it could mean a lot going forward to the place of Europe in the world, of how we deal with Ukraine and aid and reforms. I mean, what I also hear in the markets, and we've seen this like big move in euro and French bond spreads, our favorite subject, is that they worry that actually if there's a PM from Le Pen's party, that they don't fund, that we could have like a mini budget crisis, or not so many, just a budget crisis like we've had in the UK, that if they want to put the retirement age at 60, well, how are they going to fund that?
I think you could find a very possible answer to Adrian's question is you could end up, if you look across all these different races, there could be one theme where Maloney is a standard bearer here. And obviously this may not be acceptable to many of us, but it's there, that if you run a kind of populist nationalist party, but you temper it with a bit of economics, which pro-business stuff, that applies to Maloney.
Yeah.
That could apply to the next Conservative Party here. It's certainly if you were in America, many people would say that is exactly what Donald Trump is. He is nationalism, but he sure knows how to look after business, and he sure knows how to deliver things, especially to the kind of white middle class.
But their intention, though, aren't they? For instance, how do you do a program like that where business is saying we want more workers, and then you're having to have quite tight immigration controls. The next whichever government it is will have to be tighter. So I think, you completely get the theory, but in reality, it's tough to pull off.
I think it probably works better if you're on a huge economy like America than if you're on a smaller one. But yes, but there is a kind of, if you had to look, and if I was looking and I had to try and guess which brand of politics, notwithstanding what happened to Modi still did reasonably well. There is a kind of brand emerging, which is not one which is at all amicable with various causes, which many of us have spouted in the past, a kind of global liberalism. But there is something emerging, which is this much more right-wing than we have expected up to now, but with a sort of bit of nationalism and quite a lot of business-friendly. Give business just enough to stick on side, give them money so that they will back you if you're Donald Trump. You see quite a lot of Italian business people who don't want to be particularly seen with Maloney, but are prepared to,
So it's a sort of nationalist liberalism. I must say, last time when I was in the United States last time, I was talking to some money people, and these were people who'd all.
I hope they were useful.
These were people who'd all basically said after the riots and on Capitol Hill that they would never ever vote for Trump, and they were all saying, well, actually, we've sort of changed our mind. I think the money, Wall Street and money and business in America, having been very reluctant about Trump, is suddenly saying, okay, we'd rather have him than the old guy.
I couldn't help thinking about that as people were talking about the rise of Nigel Farage last week. There was quite a lot of conversation about whether or not he would ever be acceptable to a large chunk of Conservative voters. And I think that at least for some, sounded to me rather complacent in saying, there was a chunk of natural Conservative voter that would never find him an acceptable person to vote for. And it reminded me a lot of Republicans, 5 or 6 years ago, who said, they'd never or longer, that our party would never consistently support someone like that.
The never Trumpers,
The never
who
Trumpers.
was
who
never
are very-
employed
who were,
again.
Yeah, pretty thin on the ground. Okay, we've had a couple of questions, actually both about the UK. One from Faiz Jamil. Immigration is seen as a strength in some countries, as a way to grow their economies and bring in a diversity of skills and knowledge. Why is immigration seen so negatively in the UK by the two major parties?
Good question.
Well, I mean, I'll take the start of it because in the last decade or 15 years, the perception was pre-Brexit that it undercut people's wages. So you had a pure economic problem coming from immigration. And what we're dealing with now is the sort of long tail of that, which is there's still an economic concern about people taking UK jobs and all of that. But at the same time, as we just sort of alluded to, you've also got business saying we need more immigrants and we need more workers and we need them to be more highly skilled. But even today you had Starmer saying, no, I'm not going to renegotiate freedom of movement. Yeah. So, that just tells you everything you need to know, even though he will have people in his party saying, please relax this because we do need to get more workers in and they need to be more highly skilled and so on. It's just such a third rail issue.
I'm not sure about the first part of that question. I can't think of these countries that are crying out that are very positive about immigrants, anti-immigrant sentiment. Where?
Canada.
Canada should be, but
I'm not sure.
Has a goal of, I think, 1 million people a year.
I think Canada.
There's a lot of populist sentiment.
We did do a really good Bloomberg piece.
If there's an election in Canada, immigration will be the main issue.
But at least one of the two is not viewed negatively by both of the mainstream parties. It has been a major plank of
but there's a massive amount of worry right across Europe, in the United States, which has got plenty of spare room, about immigration. I think the problem is, Henry Ford once said, how come is it that when I want a pair of hands, I get a human being as well? And we've tended to think of immigration just as an addition of labour, but you also get people who need to be housed, who need to be educated, who need to, who put pressure on infrastructure. And we've not set a policy agenda that deals with immigration in the round. We haven't built the resources. And I think that's true right across Europe. It's just
Henry Ford has somehow got this great reputation as a paternalist. I think it's not resting on that quote.
He was a paternalist of a sort.
I mean, one of the things I reflect on after Brexit was that the immigration piece of that was about controlling immigration. It wasn't necessarily about reducing it. I know, like in the sort of squashing of the story of Brexit, that's been lost. And then you got PM Boris Johnson and others, Michael Gove, and they were really, really pro-immigration. And in the end, you have seen a massive increase in non-EU immigration. And that's what we're dealing with right now. We're dealing with the debate moving on to be, yes, freedom of movement was stopped. And so that dealt with the EU immigration, but something else has taken its place.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that in the immediate aftermath of the referendum, it was often pointed out that immigration was no longer a big issue. People did feel that they had, quote unquote, dealt with it. Yeah. But the sheer numbers, and I think the way, going back to the question of why it's felt negatively by parties, by people, is that it has coincided with this squeeze on, particularly on local government services caused by Brexit, or by austerity. That was associated, a very strategic decision to cut by a third in real times those core local services, which were the ones that were most squeezed by unanticipated, unplanned immigration. So I think that does...
But you get a similar rise in anti-immigration sentiment in Germany without all of these particular factors.
Though with a very rapid influx still around the period of Syria. So I think we've got another question that's actually, we can bring Peggy back on the stage with, I'm told you have a handheld mic, yes. How important are the running mates for both candidates in this election, given their age and perhaps their need to widen their appeal? I mean, we're waiting avidly to hear who President Trump decides. I think he's going to keep us waiting a bit longer.
Yes. Well, our expectation is that Trump will announce his vice presidential nominee at the convention, which is in the middle of July. He has run this somewhat similar to his Apprentice TV show, where he's kept a number of people hanging, but we are kind of narrowing down to a handful left. But I do think it's going to be important, to your point, Stephanie, because of the age of both the men that are running in the U.S. presidential election. And then, of course, because there's a lot of attention on Biden, and Harris being his vice president would be the person who would take over the mantle. So I do think it's going to be important to see who Trump picks. Does the person balance him out some ways in terms of attracting some of the moderate voters. Nikki Haley did win a number of votes in every state, in some cases about 30%, and has continued to pick up some votes along the way, even after Trump was designated the nominee. So she's certainly still in the mix there, but there are others like J.D. Vance, Senator from Ohio, Doug Burgum, and Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina. So we'll see what happens.
There has been some discussion around whether there's already quite a lot of money, obviously, going into his campaign. But supposedly some high-profile donors in the side, sort of in the wings, waiting to see if there's a vice president who will be a sort of grown-up in the room. I don't know whether, I mean, some people would say that's just they just want to have an excuse to give him more money, and they're going to give him money anyway. But do you think that's true, that there's sort of a wall of money waiting there, depending on whether he picks someone who's sort of sensible or crazy, or more sensible than crazy?
I think it's true that there are some people waiting on the sidelines, particularly in business and on Wall Street, who backed other candidates along the way and are waiting to see who he picked and putting some pressure on there. I'm not sure it's a wall of money, but I think it's a tangible amount.
I think there's a considerable amount of money. If Trump were to choose Haley, for instance, that would be a fig leaf, a very unfortunate way to describe that, but for him. For people, business people who were already leaning quietly towards Trump because of tax cuts and things, to say, look, he isn't that bad. It's the same argument you heard a bit in 2016, that Donald Trump isn't as extreme as you think. And if you could say, look, he's picked Nikki Haley, that would help. It would also help quite a lot. You look at the swing voters, white suburban women, absolutely to the fore there, and Nikki Haley would help a bit with that. And the question for Trump is how much he prizes loyalty, which tends to be his main thing. And it has to be remembered that he did call Nikki Haley bird brain for most of the campaign. So whether that particularly is something that he would
vice bird brain.
It's unlikely to be Mike Pence, I think.
But needless to say, Nikki Haley, to your point, John, given that name calling, Nikki Haley did endorse him much sooner than maybe some people would have thought. So.
She's very shrewdly came out and supportive of him during his trial as well.
Yes.
There's a question which is a massive question, so I'm going to give it to John, and you can give a very short answer, so that we end more or less on time. But which question would each? Oh wait, this is not the one. This another one has moved. Oh, okay. How will Europe and the UK solve the US-China dilemma? I guess the point of choosing. Will trade trump the security relationship? I guess you could just have a one-word answer. Will trade come first, trade or security?
With great difficulty. I think in the end, security will matter. And I think what you see, and you put any collection of European and American leaders together, for all the difficulty and all the kind of madness that is going on, there is a very steadfast. And I think this is Peggy, I think would agree, across both parties in America. Totally. There is an absolute certainty that China is now the enemy. China is the thing they need to beat. There is a disagreement in America about how much you can do to your main allies in trying to be with some people on the Republican side, thinking you have to bully the Europeans in. But in general, the idea that there is China and there is Russia, and they are set against everything that most of the people in this room stand for, that is a feeling which is much more consciously put forward in America, but I think is also gradually coming to Europe. So from that perspective, I would say that it is security that comes through.
One of the remarkable things about America is that we think about it as being a divided and a polarized country. But when it comes to policy towards China, both the main parties are absolutely united over it, and all sort of serious policymakers are united over it. Trump's line on China has become the line that everybody takes about China now, and Europe is slowly catching up. But Europe's going in the same direction because the threat from China is massive. They're building a lot of bombs. They're investing a lot of money in their defence, and they're aggressively against Western values, liberalism.
So, Adrian, you've confirmed one of the conclusions of your long working partnership and book writing partnership with John Micklethwait, that you will never let him have the last word. That's the end of this special live episode of Voternomics, or live taping of Voternomics. Thank you to everyone here for coming. Thank you to Summer Sadi, Victoria Wakely, Erin Levy, and lots of other people who've helped put this event together. And to our guests, Peggy Collins and Francine Lacqua, special guest star, Editor-in-Chief John Micklethwait, and Adrian and Allegra. I'll see you later in the week, I think.
Yeah,